Ambassador Dame Karen Pierce is the current British ambassador to the United States, having previously served as British ambassador to the UN. Her appointment earlier this year followed the resignation of Lord Kim Darroch, following the leak of diplomatic cables critical of the president. She joins us to discuss the future of UK-US relations post-Brexit, future international challenges, and the UK's climate agenda. Welcome, Dame Karen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm far more terrified of this than I ever was in the Security Council.
It's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much. So to start off, you've taken on the role of British ambassador to the US at what couldn't be much more of a difficult time for so many different reasons. The UK is finding its feet on the world stage outside of the EU. The US president is a somewhat chaotic figure to work with, and both nations are dealing with a pandemic. What, in your opinion, has been your greatest challenge since you took on the role?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this, as you say, it's an interesting year. It's a difficult year. And in many ways, it would have been the sort of year in which we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And so everybody began this year thinking some really important anniversaries are coming up. End of World War II in Europe, end of World War II in Japan, United Nations. And then we've all had to change those expectations because of COVID. And I think COVID has been the most difficult thing we've had to deal with here. I've had to deal with here this year. I arrived just after lockdown in DC. I came down from New York and escaped lockdown there, but ran into it fair and square in DC. Diplomacy is a contact sport. I've had to learn to do things on the phone and by Zoom panels, and I'm very much the sort of person who prefers to do something in person. So that's been a personal challenge for me. We've had to lock down the whole embassy and only now been able to bring people back into the workplace. Just to be clear, they have been working, but there's something about being in a workplace, I think, that's quite important. And I've had to get to know the administration. Now, luckily for me, I'd already met the president before. I'd already met a number of the administration senior figures before, and they have been very kind to me, and I've been able to go down to the White House and State Department. But it's been an unusual year in very many ways, and of course we're not out of it. I feel very sorry for my diplomatic colleagues, though, over on the west coast of America. We have 2 consulates and some offices over there, and they've not only had lockdown and the pandemic to cope with, they've also had the California and Northwest Coast fires. And that really has been difficult because they've had to stay indoors. Children have had to stay indoors. So I look at them and I think, well, how can I help them get through this? So a lot to think about.
Of course, with the lockdown ongoing, you've basically had to establish yourself completely, as you mentioned, from within the embassy. What kind of difficulties have you faced in doing that? I know you have plenty of experience in the US before and worked in New York beforehand, but how on earth do you do a job that is so much about in-person collaboration, cooperation, or relationships with people when essentially you're locked in?
Well, at one level, with external context, like the administration, like Congress, like journalists and think tanks here, through various other jobs I've done, I already had quite a good American network. And it's the 4th time I've served in the US and the 2nd time in Washington. So some of those contacts were still there. And thanks in particular to the fact that the Security Council is broadcast, a number of people had seen me in the Security Council. Much harder to establish yourself with your own team because so many people, like I guess you guys are doing, are working from home. They're on the Zoom or Teams from home. And how do you get visibility and how do you make those connections? We were very good at the start, I think, as an embassy. We had lots of masterclasses. We wanted to do a cocktail masterclass, but we've never quite got round to that. I did one on protocol, which is a particular bugbear of mine. And to my astonishment, 500 people dialed in from all the British offices around the US. So I think it must have been a very slow news day that day. But, we have tried to do things like that. We haven't quite got to the level of being able to talk to the whole network, which is about 700 people at once, just because government IT works a bit differently from commercial IT. But we do our best to keep in touch with all our consulates and with the teams. Now, I have to admit, some of it I do on audio because it's just easier sometimes to communicate on audio without looking and thinking, oh my God, my hair is such a mess. But it's important, I think, to be friendly and important to try and keep that team spirit going on which embassies of all sorts around the world rely. So it hasn't been easy, but we think on the whole we're doing okay.
Fantastic. And speaking of that collaboration, obviously when you took the job, you were replacing someone who'd had to leave amid somewhat a level of chaos regarding the leak of diplomatic cables, some diplomatic issues there. Did you find that there was a relationship that you needed to work on repairing when you came in?
Not really, because the resignation of Kim Darroch drew a line under the whole matter. And that was his motivation, I think, in resigning. He's a very fine diplomat. He's a good friend of mine. I've actually worked for him in previous jobs. And personally, I think it was a shame what happened to him, and whoever linked the cables committed a criminal offence and certainly wasn't interested in supporting the US-UK relationship. But everybody since I've got here has been very warm, very encouraging, Republican and Democrat, whether in the administration or in Congress. Lots of warm words about the UK, lots of warm words about working together, and the rest of the diplomatic community here is pulling together in the face of COVID. We've got rather good at the social distancing lunch. So that's something that brings people together.
Wonderful. Of course, as Ambassador to the United States, it would probably be fair to say that one of your major roles, if not your role, is to uphold the so-called special relationship. But obviously, for so many people in Britain, this has meant Britain being in America's pocket in various ways over the course of history, especially when it comes to things like foreign intervention. So I just wanted to ask what the special relationship means to you today and how you would go about pursuing a strong relationship with the US without just doing what the US wants us to do.
Well, if I may, as your president of the Oxford Union, and this is, a world-renowned debating forum, I'm going to take issue with the premise of the question. I think most people in Britain actually recognise and value what the United States has brought since the end of World War II, which is fundamentally an implicit security and prosperity guarantee that on the whole, we can all think of exceptions, on the whole has kept us safe and secure for over 75 years. And that contribution, I think, is incredibly important. And American science and American engagement in the world. I mean, America fundamentally built the United Nations with some help from us and others, but fundamentally an American construct. So that level of engagement in the world, I think, is well recognized and appreciated by most people in Britain. And I think most people in Britain feel the same sort of friendship towards Americans and America itself that they feel towards us. Now, I think it's also true to say that the demographic in America is changing. There are probably proportionately fewer people with direct links to Europe and the UK. So I certainly see it as one of my jobs here to find ways to renew all those ties, people to people ties, that when I was here 25 years ago were perhaps more of the fabric of the relationship at the people level. Otherwise, the US-UK relationship is very deep, profound, and successful. It predates the Second World War, but most people think of it as having been crystallized by the Second World War, and I think that's fair. And since then, we've built up this deep but also broad bedrock of cooperation in almost all fields of professional life. Whether it's science, whether it's defense, whether it's intelligence, whether it's diplomacy, human rights, engagement overseas. And that's a very, very strong bedrock. And I think it's fair to say it is unique in the history of international relations. As for foreign intervention, I think one can always criticize individual decisions. I'm sure many of your audience can think right now of some they'd like to criticize, and we'll see what the questions throw up. But having personally been involved in some of those foreign interventions, and also having been in America 25 years ago when we didn't intervene till much later in Bosnia, and then we had the massacre later described as genocide at Srebrenica, and then to have been in the Kosovo intervention when I was in London, it brings home to you that sometimes, not in every case, sometimes the use of military force is the lesser of two evils. And that's certainly how I would approach the majority of interventions. As I say, one can always criticize individual operations.
So how is it changing as we exit the EU in the UK? How are we approaching America, finding our feet on the international stage again? Sorry, I think I said UK, I meant EU.
I don't think, to be honest, in the US, and when I was at the UN, because we have always functioned in a special way in both the UN and the US as the UK, and only secondarily as a member of the European Union, I don't think the difference is as stark on this side of the Atlantic as it might be elsewhere in the world. And at the UN, you know, we're one of the major donors to the UN. We sit as a permanent member on the Security Council. We're one of the founding members. We're involved in almost everything, every big enterprise the UN does. And of course, we have our official development assistance at 0.7% of GDP, and we're a leading player on climate. So all those things are independent of the European Union, and that's true for France as well. So I think it is true to say that now we've left the EU, the United Nations becomes an even bigger stage for Britain to show that she's a reliable partner, a major player in all the big international enterprises of the day, a major contributor to security and to economic development. The Foreign Secretary likes to talk of it as a force for good, and he sees our work on free trade, on climate, on human rights as all lending support to that notion of using the UN, using international institutions and the bilateral relationship with the US to try and advance the agenda on a lot of different fronts that hopefully contribute to improving the state of the world.
Fantastic. But of course, the UN is very important for agenda setting and for having an influence on the international stage, but more in terms of day-to-day things that we have to do, simple things like trade, that we previously relied so much more on the EU for and are going to have to find new ways of approaching. Do you think that that will significantly change the UK-US relationship, particularly in economic terms, or do you think that we'll be looking elsewhere?
I think it changes the activity. I don't think it changes the fundamentals of the relationship. The most obvious example, and you're right to pick trade, previously, the EU and the US were trying to negotiate a free trade deal between them. And obviously the UK was part of that EU agreement and that EU negotiation. Now we've left, we have a negotiation underway ourselves, US-UK, for a free trade deal. Now, by definition, this will be smaller than it would be with the EU. It's just one country. But because we're not in the European Union, we can take the negotiations into areas that the European Union might struggle to get consensus across all its members. So I'm thinking particularly of audio-visual. That's worth a lot of money to both the US and the UK. It's at some $2 to $3 billion a year at the moment, and that can grow. If it's a deal with the European Union, there are automatic constraints on how liberalising the EU wants to be on audiovisual, say. The same on some agricultural products, the same on things like digital and e-commerce, because the deal is between two countries, US and UK, we have a bit more flexibility, scope for innovation. We really want to look at things like e-commerce. What do trading rules mean in a digital world? And if we get this right, then this would be the first free trade agreement to look at that digital aspect, and therefore it might set a trend. And I think that's quite exciting.
Wonderful. To go back to what we mentioned before about, you mentioned about the UN and agenda setting and international norms, and I suppose defending what some British governments might describe as British values, things like democracy, liberal democracy, rule of law, etc. If, as many is expecting, the US is facing a very messy election year that will be at best messy and at worst potentially violent or very chaotic in its outcome, how do you prioritise these aims, defending Britain's good relationship with the US on the one hand and smooth relationships between the two countries, and defending normal democratic practice and the ideals that we like to think we uphold as two countries on the other?
I think the first thing to say that as diplomats in an embassy, we don't get involved in the detail at all of another country's election. And I think if the result were not clear on the night, we wouldn't want to say anything publicly, because fundamentally this is an election by the American people. And even more fundamentally, America is a sophisticated society governed by the rule of law. It has its own mechanisms, it has its own checks and balances. It's a fantastic democracy, capable of great things, capable, in my view, of infinite renewal. It's not as if we were dealing with a country where democracy had been suppressed, where in those circumstances, Britain might take a different view. So I think it's very much for the American people and all those mechanisms that do exist to allow the process to be played out in the way that the founding fathers of the Constitution intended. But again, I do want to just point out the infinite renewal ability that America has, and the fact that this is a tolerant, open, liberal, free trading, democratic society. That's very important. I know in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, people have queried some of the things they've seen in America. But the fact that citizens are equal before the law remains as fundamental a principle in America as it does in Britain. So I am not worried that our values clash with what we see. Americans share those values, and the election will play out according to them and according to the Constitution.
I want to discuss a couple of major points of clash between UK and US foreign policy. The first being Iran. You supported the nuclear deal quite vocally, and then Trump, of course, ripped it up. When you're attempting to collaborate on the shared goal of something like stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, how do you cooperate when your approaches to this differ so much?
Well, the first thing to say is we've got the same aim, which is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And you're absolutely right that we see that differently between Britain and the US, but also Britain, France and Germany, and on the whole, the European Union on one side do see it differently from the Trump administration. You know, we do want to keep the nuclear deal in being. It's not perfect, but it is the only agreement under which Iran doesn't acquire a nuclear weapon. And we think that's a very important contribution, key priority of non-proliferation and in the security of Europe, because it is likely that any nuclear missiles that were developed would be able to hit Western Europe. So we start from different places, but at the same time, we do share the US concern about the behavior of Iran in certain parts of the Middle East, which is destabilizing. And one can think of Syria, one can think of the missiles pointing at Israel, one can think of Lebanon, and one can think of the proxy intervention in Yemen. And these are things that are of great concern to a number of countries in the Middle East and beyond. And we would like to work with the US and others and with Iran to find a way of containing this and ultimately bringing Iran in from the cold. I think that's the key point. Fundamentally, Iran is a country with an ancient civilization, wonderful people, but she's put herself out of the norms of behavior, if you like, of most countries. And the ultimate goal is to bring Iran back into the fold as an equal country that respects international norms and laws. And I think that is shared by everybody.
So in terms of the day-to-day practice of collaboration and cooperation and getting towards that shared goal, almost where do you start when your views of how you do it as countries are so different?
Well, this is sometimes the difference between what ministers do and what officials do. So ministers set these big goals, and then we sit down and we work out how to reconcile the seemingly irreconcilable. And we can do it. We can do things in the UN, things with the financial system. We can work, those of us who are still in the nuclear deal can work through the joint commission that upholds the nuclear deal. So that's Britain, France, Germany, Russia and China. And then you have Iran, of course. And that's chaired by a representative of the European Union. So there are certain things we can do through that. There are certain things we can do in the Security Council. There's certain aspects of bilateral diplomacy, and there's certain aspects of regional diplomacy. And basically, when you have a big disagreement, as we do over the nuclear deal, you just try and use all those other levers to meet your other policy goals. If after the election there were to open up the prospect of another deal or deals with Iran that the US could accept, then Boris Johnson has been clear that we would be very ready to look at that. But for the moment, we use all these other levers that are available to us.
So would you say that collaboration with our European allies is just as important as ever and hasn't changed despite everything about Brexit?
Oh, the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary would absolutely tell you that. Prime Minister is very clear. We've left the EU. We're not leaving Europe. We want the strongest possible partnership with our European colleagues and partners. We don't see it as an exclusive. We believe we can have partnerships with lots of countries in the same level, a little bit like siblings in a family. So there'll be the US, obviously, but then there are the Commonwealth partners like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We work very closely with India and Japan. So really, we don't want to be exclusive. We'd like to have very strong partnerships and alliances with a whole set of countries, fundamentally countries who believe in open societies. And that obviously includes countries in the EU.
Fantastic. So then to move on to another foreign policy issue, I'm afraid. On Russia, you made headlines in 2018 when you were at the UN, when you clashed with your Russian counterpart on the Security Council about the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. So what do you think in your current role, the UK and US shared attitude should be to Russia? And do things like friendship between Trump and Putin concern you in how we should approach Russia on the international stage?
I'm certainly not concerned by the relationship between Presidents Trump and Putin. I think both we and America, and to be honest, all of NATO, do share a concern about the continuing threat of Russia to Western values, but also to the security of the Euro-Atlantic region, to be absolutely frank. And this security is at risk not just from a new generation of Russian weapons, also Russian cyber, and then a just kind of general undermining by Russia of Western values. And I would think that's actually quite deliberate. The Russian foreign minister has made clear that he sees this period as the end of the West. And if he meant, it's the entry into a more equal society across the globe where all sorts of countries take their rightful place on the world stage, that would be fine. He doesn't mean that. He means, we, Russia and China, are going to push back. This is a competition to set the rules of international affairs that enables Russia and China to move away from the international norms and standards and laws that fundamentally were established after World War II. And that's dangerous. And therefore, we want to keep a very close eye on Euro-Atlantic security. We work with all our partners in NATO to that end. It doesn't mean we don't also have a global reach. We need to look at security in the Indo-Pacific, for example, but we can't do it, I'm afraid, by looking only in one direction, not in the other. We have to look both ways at once.
You mentioned cybersecurity. I wanted to ask how your role and what you view, how as the major risks, in terms of international diplomacy are moving from in-person almost to online, as the major risks seem to be election interference, cybersecurity, etc. How is that changing what cooperation means to you and how you confront these risks in day-to-day diplomacy?
It's putting a very high premium on technology. And I do think at the moment, the way technology is developing, cyber AI, this is transformative. And it's transformative, probably, at least to my mind, in the way that nuclear was transformative in the 1950s, for good and bad. And the key thing is that you want such technology to be used in a way that reinforces multi-stakeholder models, so private sector, civil society, government. And you don't want it to be used, to put it crudely, to spy on your own citizens in your cities. That would be a very bad use of all this new technology. But in terms of how you combat the threat, you need very sophisticated approaches. We have the National Cyber Centre, which is a relatively recent part of government set up exactly for these means. And they collaborate with their equivalents around the world to detect cybercrime and then to work out strategies of how best to counter it. At some stage, we may even have to counter it on the international stage. Do we need a convention? Do we need more diplomatic instruments? But we're not at that stage yet.
Fantastic. So to move on to one of the issues I know that you're particularly concerned about, the climate crisis and our green future, I wanted to ask about how you're using your role to ensure that the UK and US are cooperating as two of the largest economies in the world and therefore big contributors to the climate crisis to overcome this, to ensure that we have a more green future.
So I think one aspect of that is COVID and how we recover from the pandemic. It's really important. And Boris Johnson has said this, really important to come out of the pandemic in a way that is greener, cleaner, and more sustainable. And at the macro level, really important to do it in a way that reinforces open societies, tolerance, liberal trade, democracy, all those things that have kept societies thriving. We don't want the measures we bring in to cope with pandemics to be closing down that openness at all. There's something very important about economic resilience in all of that as well, that we're looking at, particularly in the context of G7 and G20. In terms of me personally, we have a big campaign in the embassy, and my colleagues in the UK mission at the UN have a subset of that for the UN. We in Italy will chair COP26 next year in Glasgow. So that's the 5-year horizon after the Paris Agreement. And we really want that to be a place where countries make ambitious pledges nationally in 5 key areas. One is around green finance. How do we get the right financial instruments? One is around nature-based solutions. UK's just become one of the biggest countries in the world for offshore wind, and the cost of that keeps coming down. So that's a great thing for the UK for the future. The stuff around net zero, low energy, including buildings. So we want countries to make pledges on those, but we want to make a step change so we start affecting global warming. Here in the US, at the moment, because, as you will know, the Trump administration is planning to pull out of the Paris Agreement. So we can't work with the American government on those particular pledges and Paris, but we do work with governors in the individual states and with mayors in city halls. And America is such a large country, such a big economy, that the contributions of those individual states actually fulfill the national contribution America was due to make under Paris. So one can always go further. We'll have to see who wins the election, because that will change the climate approach of the United States. But I think if one looks at it from a different angle, like biodiversity or clean water, then you have much more agreement across both the parties in America. So there are things in the biodiversity and oceans region that we can work on.
Fantastic. And then final question from me before I start asking you audience questions. You've been something of a trailblazer at various points in your career. You were the first female UK permanent representative at the UN. You were the first female UK ambassador to the US. And diplomacy, and I suppose civil service in general, have often seemed somewhat behind in terms of moving beyond the sort of gentleman's club smoke-filled room atmosphere that has often been historically associated with it. So my final question is, where are we now, and how much further is there to go in terms of ensuring diversity in UK appointments overseas and the influence as a result that we're having around the world?
Oh, I don't want to do down my own profession, but a lot of people would say that diplomacy is just behind the rest of the world, full stop. When I was in Washington 25 years ago for the first time, there was a book out about the sailing ships. And it was positing that diplomats were as out of date as sailing ships, and it was all time to move on and do everything by phone and video. And someone asked Henry Kissinger this, and he said, no, it wouldn't work. And when asked why not, he said, because he wouldn't pick up the phone. So, there is something very important about human contact, as we said at the beginning. Obviously, COVID has shown that a lot of good work can be done, including in diplomacy, including between world leaders on Zoom, by phone. But I think every so often you need that direct human contact. But there are some very interesting things about how we can now get our campaigns reaching more people on social media, say. So as well as climate, when we had a campaign about antimicrobial resistance, if we're smart and we've got lots of people in foreign ministries looking at data, looking at digital, we can get a broader message out and hence get more support for some of these big global issues like health and climate.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we'll move towards audience questions now. Please submit questions, as I mentioned, using the Q&A function. Please leave your name and college if you feel comfortable, and I will credit the question to you. So to start off, the first question is from Jamie Bamber from University College, who says, how much does the role of UK ambassador change with different UK governments? Noting that UK ambassadors are, of course, civil servants compared to the often political appointments of US ambassadors. So he wants to know how much you have to reflect Conservative Party ideas and policy while maintaining political independence, and how that changes from your differs from your counterpart, perhaps.
Well, first of all, University College is my son's college, so that's all good, obviously. That's a great question. Because we're civil servants, we reflect the policies of the government of the day. Now, in foreign policy, on the whole, not in every case, on the whole, there's more continuity than there might be, say, in fiscal policy. So it isn't as difficult as it might at first seem to change the emphasis. So, I'm trying to think, I don't think I've been abroad when the government changed. So I can't give you a concrete example of being abroad. But when I was in London and Tony Blair won in 1997, he came in with a very firm idea, and Robin Cook had his ethical foreign policy, which some people mocked at the time, but it was an attempt to give us a direction. And they came in determined to do more in the Balkans, say. So it wasn't that we had to change course. It was simply that we had to become more proactive. And that's usually the balance, that's usually the difference that you will see. Negotiating Brexit, of course, has been one very different strand of work from what I've just described. But because I'm not in the European Union country, that has not affected me personally. So I haven't been involved in those negotiations. And it's your job as a civil servant to reflect government policy and to carry it out. Ministers make the decisions, civil servants make the policy recommendations, and then you implement them as best you can. And that's part of your duty. If you disagree with the decision of the minister and you cannot persuade the minister that your arguments are so compelling that he or she should change their decision, then I'm afraid you have to step away from that discipline and possibly ultimately from being a civil servant. But on the whole, it's a much more collaborative process of policy making than the question might seem.
Thank you. A question from Otto Barrett, Magdalen College, who wants to know how the inclusion of DFID into the FCO has changed your role and what collaboration you see between the UK and US in terms of aid.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much for that question. The Foreign Secretary would be very pleased that someone's asked that question straight off, because he's very proud of the merger. The immediate difference isn't felt in the US because we don't have development programs here. If I was still in Afghanistan, then there would be a change in the way we allocate money and decide programs. So there wouldn't be a separate aid wing in the embassy. Instead of an aid wing, we'd say integrate our human rights so that the people on the policy side doing human rights would be integrated with the people on the development side doing human rights, and the money would flow for the priorities that we collectively identified. Here in the States, as you said, it is much more about collaboration on aid policy. And we're just starting that now with the American government, with US AID. Foreign Secretary visited recently and they talked through some areas in the world and some themes where we might be able to have a greater impact just because we can align policy and assistance in a much more coherent way than we've been able to do before. All that said, USAID is not integrated into State Department, much as my State Department colleagues would wish it were. But there's still a lot that we can work on together. And I think we will probably initially, whoever wins the election, do a lot together on human rights and putting resources into programs to enhance human rights and the rule of law.
Thank you. A question from Adnan, which is that you mentioned protocol. Has the move to remote meetings impacted multilateral democracy, especially for less wealthy countries who might struggle with the high costs associated?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think we'd have to ask my colleagues in the UN. They have been able to do a lot of UN meetings by Zoom. And you have to establish all sorts of protocols to enable that to happen. And also they've had to change the voting system in some UN meetings because of doing it all remotely. On the whole now, most developing countries have the technology to be able to take part. And it hasn't so far been a problem. And there are ways of assisting the poorer nations at the UN with the IT. But when I was first there at the UN in 2006, it was a big issue, the disparity in IT, because we were trying to make the UN be more efficient and save money. And they were printing huge numbers of documents. And we were trying to get all these made available electronically, not in hard copy. But of course, for some developing countries, they didn't have the IT to do that. So, we had to struggle a bit to work out what was the right balance that kept the UN efficient and saved paper while making sure everybody had equal access to it. I think they're pretty much there now.
Fantastic. We've had quite a few questions about Chinese relations. So Shannon Yang at St Anne's, for instance, how do you think UK-China relations will be impacted by the US's current relationship with China? We've had a couple of other people ask this question with specific reference to the Huawei affair, for instance. So if you could mention that perhaps.
I'll start with Huawei then. And that's quite a technical thing, not a political thing. The British government had originally concluded that Huawei could be in what's called the periphery of the UK's telecommunications system, because then it would be away from the core where our national security telecommunications are. And the reason that matters, in case anyone doesn't know, is because Huawei, the company, is very closely linked to the Chinese state. And there have been examples, sorry to say, of that not being used honestly and being used for subversive and other purposes. So it's very important that Huawei did not access the inner core of UK national security. And that was possible. That was the original decision, was done in such a way that that distance was possible. The US Department of Commerce then introduced export controls that meant Huawei could not have US components. And that changed our security assessment of our levels of satisfaction, if you like, about what Huawei could and could not access. And therefore we changed our view because we could no longer guarantee there wouldn't be a security impact on national security. But that was technical. In terms of the overall relationship with China, we the UK, want a productive, thriving relationship with China and the Chinese people. But we worry about a number of things. We worry about human rights, and what happens in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs is one example of that. We worry about Hong Kong and the application of the national security law, which has broken the Sino-UK agreement of 1997. We worry also about a level playing field in trade. This is disputes that go through the WTO. And we have some concerns about the way China handled COVID and the various authoritarianism and disinformation that flowed from some of those decisions. And we worry about the fact that some Chinese companies are very close to, if not actually substitutes for, the Chinese state, with all that implies for national security. That said, we believe China is a very important country, and that if we want to tackle some of the biggest problems like health and climate at a global level, it is indispensable to work with China, and we are very ready to do that. We're very ready to have political and economic relationships, but they have to be on the basis of a level playing field.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Charlie Hancock at Hartford, who says, do you anticipate that a Democratic victory in November may throw up more challenges or more opportunities in negotiations for a UK-US trade deal?
I mean, I can't comment on that, I'm afraid, because we have to be very strictly impartial. But just to say, it's our general aim to make good progress on the trade deal so that it will not be onerous for a new Congress, which will come in after inauguration on January 20, will not be onerous to pass that deal. In other words, it wouldn't involve them in lots and lots of work. So we would hope that we get a good deal and then it's relatively smooth to get it through under either Trump or Biden.
Thank you. A question from Anthony Moody, which is, after all the events with your predecessor, has the Foreign Office established a formal protocol to guide you and other ambassadors on commenting on heads of state in the future?
It's not so much commenting on heads of state as it's an ambassador's job, an embassy's job, right the way around the world, but any country, to report to their capital the unvarnished version of how they see it. And this is why the things we write are kept confidential. So I think anybody seeing leaks is always a little bit wary, but it was very quickly established by the Foreign Office that our duty is to carry on reporting what we see and how we assess it and what that means for British interests. You may recall that at the time Kim's cables and documents were published, some British ministers said they disagreed with Kim's assessment, but they absolutely defended his duty as well as his right to put it on paper and advise the government of the day. So I think that's where things rest at the moment.
Thank you. And then I suppose as a final question from the audience, this is a question from Charles Tolkien-Gillett at Merton College, who says, as a UK-US resident, I would firstly like to thank you for your lifelong dedication to the FCO and special relationship. The thing that I think I would find most difficult about being in your position is staying rational and connected with people like Trump, who constantly show little respect for our institutions. He gives examples of his comments about Sir Kim, Meghan Markle, British values like racial equality. So he wants to know whether you have something, for instance, an idea, vision, or experience that you always turn back on to give you hope and motivation when working in these environments.
Well, I've also worked alongside Serbian people in Serbia indicted for war crimes. So the point I'm trying to make is that you must be a professional, whichever environment you're in. You represent your country. You have a duty as a diplomat. You have a duty to your country, and it's not about you personally. That said, I do want to say that I love America. I've been lucky enough to serve 4 times here, as I said, 2 at the UN, 2 in Washington. This is my second. And my job is to get to know both parties, all the political leadership, the American people, to get to know what motivates people in the extreme Northwest as in the Southeast and vice versa, to really understand this country in all its forms, to understand and work with its leadership, no matter whom the American people choose on November the 3rd. And that's the job of all diplomats. But, you know, we have, as we were saying earlier, a special relationship with the US, and that will endure, I'm confident, whether it's President Trump or President Biden. I've had the pleasure of meeting both President Trump, and I met Vice President Biden earlier. It's for the American people to choose, not me, but I can promise that we will do our very best to work as collaboratively and cooperatively with the next American administration, whichever it might be.
Great, thank you very much. I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Dame Karen. Sorry, we would applaud you, but that is not possible.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks
Thank
for having
you,
me.
everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for our first live online event. I hope you've all enjoyed it and that it's been as participatory as possible.
Great. Well, thank you, and everybody have a great rest of term. Hope it goes well.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.